Hi, my name is Christopher Boyle, and this is my presentation on the impact of World War II on cinema. Cinema is an ever-present and extremely influential component of society. Films are an amazing way for filmmakers and producers to make personal and political statements. Thus, film has been an essential factor in political regimes as a source of propaganda. There is no better example of this type of propaganda than in World War II. Americans, Germans, and Russians all used film as a source of propaganda before, during, and after the war. Besides creating propaganda-based movies for the war, World War II also had a huge impact on filmmaking as a whole. The films made before the war, the films made during the war, and the films made after the war are all distinctly different. For example, film noir and melodrama were two dramas that were the result of post-war filmmaking. World War II had a direct impact on the styles and techniques used for filmmaking, and it changed cinema as a whole. So the pre-war era can be described as the 10 years prior to the beginning of World War II and can be identified as a burgeoning conversion to the use of sound. The period has some of the most iconic films such as The Wizard of Oz and Frankenstein. The use of sound in film brought the use of dialogue to the forefront. This era is also known for the emergence of some film greats such as Orson Welles, who created Citizen Kane, and Frank Capra. Frank Capra is also a director who had a huge impact on cinema during World War II. And here's a quote: "The wholesale conversion to sound of all three sectors of American film industry took place in less than 15 months between late 1927 and 1929, and the profits of the major companies increased during that period by as much as 600%, and that's from the History of Motion Picture. This era can clearly be seen as a changing scene. Film quickly moved towards movies with sound, yet slowly moved towards the use of color. With the introduction of sound to the film, a new genre came to the forefront: the musical. Here's another quote: "One significant genre whose emergence was obviously contingent upon sound was the musical. Versions of Broadway musicals were among the first sound films, including, of course, the catalyst for the conversion, Warner Brothers' The Jazz Singer. And by the early 1930s, the movie musical had developed in form of sophistication to become perhaps the major American genre of the decade, and that is also from the History of Motion Picture. Musicals were birthed from the introduction of sound to films and are still featured today in fantastic movies such as La La Land and Les Mis. Yet there is one definitively iconic movie from the pre-war era of filmmaking, that is Gone with the Wind. The nearly 4-hour long film is still one of the highest grossing films to this date. It was produced during the pre-war era, yet released around the beginning of the war, thus would be considered a pre-war movie. It used a culmination of all the new and improved pre-war techniques such as sound and color. Gone with the Wind is an iconic yet controversial movie. Here's another quote stating, "Gone with the Wind was a product of its author's political and social formation, but also an epic human story that speaks meaningfully to a wide global audience. For that reason, it deserves it placed in 21st century literary and film canons, while scholars and artists must continue to address the weighty issues it raises in our troubled times," and that is from Taylor. It is a wonderful historic romance that truly shows all of the techniques utilized in a pre-war in an exemplary fashion. The pre-World War II era film can be defined as the introduction of sound and color and making the cinema experience possible for everyone. There was extreme growth in cinema over this period due to the new techniques used. Overall, cinema showed a fine growth in the pre-war era, and the beginning of the war had an extreme impact on cinema as a whole. And here's a scene from Gone with the Wind that truly
you, and I could better correct it. Here, take my handkerchief. Never at any crisis of your life have I known you to have a handkerchief.
Red, where are you going?
I'm going to Charleston, back where I belong.
Please take me with you.
No, I'm through with everything here. I want peace. I want to see if somewhere there isn't something left in life of charm and grace. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I only know that I love you.
That's your misfortune.
All right. Red!
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
This is one of the most iconic scenes in film history, and it truly shows the culmination of techniques that was developed during the pre-war era. The next era of filmmaking was the World War II era. American filmmaking took a huge turn with the beginning of World War II. All hands were on deck for the terrible war, and that even included films. Propaganda was the most important piece of filmmaking material. The government was paying filmmakers to make material that would support the US military movement. This was heavily accepted by most filmmakers, yet some were slower to accept. One of those filmmakers was Walt Disney, who did not want to make his brand political. And here's a quote stating, Walt feared that if he embraced the propaganda his enormous client was demanding, he would kill his brand. People would consider him a political filmmaker rather than a whimsical one. Still, he was having a hard time resisting the Treasury Department and the coordinator's office, which had approached him in tandem to commission a series taking aim at the Nazi way of life. Eventually, Walt agreed to do this as they asked. Ultimately produced in conjunction with Reader's Digest, the four movies Education for Death, Reason and Emotion, Death Führer's Face, and Chicken Little were Disney frontal attacks on the ridicule of Nazism. They became some of his most famous war films, and that is from Gobbler. The whole point of Walt Disney's cartoons was to send a political message for the government that could be watched by everyone. It was clear propaganda for the government against the Nazi regime. While Walt Disney is an extremely influential cartoonist, other directors also took up the propagandist mantle. Here's another quote stating, during the U.S. involvement in World War II, the Hollywood film industry cooperated closely with the government to support its war aims information campaign. Following the declaration of war on Japan, the government created a Bureau of Motion Picture Affairs to coordinate the production of entertainment features, while patriotic morale-boosting themes and messages about the American way of life. And that is from the War Years and Post-World War Trends article. The U.S. utilized films to their highest degree during World War II. The propaganda was huge, and it had a real impact on the how movies were made. And here's another quote stating, the movie thus joined other mass media culture in suggesting that the war was merely an uncomfortable prelude to perpetual post-war personal happiness for American people. And that is a quote from Steele. The era of World War II filmmaking can be defined as a propagandist material in support of the American movement. Not only did it show other countries as inferior, but also showed that American happiness would not be impacted by the war. Overall, the World War II era film is not well known for creating timeless masterpieces, but more for creating propaganda material. However, some great movies did come from this time frame, such as Casablanca and The Great Dictator. They also had wartime influences, though. The Great Dictator is a movie making fun of Hitler before the true atrocities were known, that did take some flack after the war. However, they are both wonderful movies made during the war. World War II had a huge influence on the movie industry. It was a truly horrific time frame, and it can be seen through the racist propaganda at the time. In conclusion, filmmaking during the World War II era was hugely propaganda-based. However, new genres were birthed after. And here is a scene from one of Walt Disney's cartoons.
And with artistic aspirations dreamed of brush and palette, but ended up with only the brush. His artistic efforts spurned, he soon turned to other endeavors.
Und vergiss nicht, you dopes, ich bin der abgeblossene Fresh in Deutschland, in alle Europa, ja in der ganzen Welt. My mother done told me. Say Heil!
And there were some gullible ones who listened. Especially one goose, more gullible than gooses. Geese usually go.
That's all right. That's the old stuff, kiddo. He's a smarter fellow at the...
The next era of filmmaking was the post-war era. The post-war era of filmmaking created the well-known and loved genres of film noir and melodrama. They resulted in some iconic movies and are still popular genres nowadays. A melodrama is a movie that has a plot that plays to the emotions of the audience, whereas a film noir is basically a sexualized and elegant crime drama. Film noir can be defined by its use of lighting, flashbacks, and sexualization. Another quote states, "The darkness of these films reflected the disenchantment of the times. Pessimism and disillusionment became increasingly present in the American psyche during the Great Depression of the 1930s and the war that followed. After the war, factors such as an unstable peacetime economy, McCarthyism, and the looming threat of atomic warfare manifested themselves in a collective sense of uncertainty." And that is from the Film Noir article. Film noir is a stark contrast from the feel-good movies of the pre-war era and the propaganda of World War II. Though the focus of film noir was more on the use of technical skills in a well-developed story than anything else, the most iconic film noir, without a doubt, is The Godfather. It is inarguably one of the greatest films of all time, and it shows what a true film noir is. And another quote states, "Whereas the book was a sensation in its time, the film has become a renowned classic, a testament to the aesthetic possibilities of American mainstream cinema." And that is from Poon. The Godfather is a perfect representation of American cinema. It shows the melting pot diversity that is America, while also utilizing deeply American filmmaking techniques. Whereas film noir movies are known for their dark and action-packed stories, melodramas hit a more emotional note. Here is another quote stating, "Quantitative analysis indicated that subjects were more sensitive to the characters' emotions in a melodrama, found this genre to be more complex, and were more apt to experience personal memories. Quantitative analysis revealed that subjects were more aware of the characters' emotions and were more likely to identify with the character in melodramas." And that is from Hilscher, Kupchik, and Leonard. Melodramas are more realistic stories, and we're just trying to get an emotional response from the audience. While it is difficult to relate to the characters of film noir, it is a completely different story from melodramas. A perfect example of a melodrama would be Written on the Wind by Douglas Sirk. Another quote states, "Perhaps best representing Sirk's point of view is his film Written on the Wind, 1956. This picture fulfills many of the tenets of American film melodrama, not only reaching for tragedy, by ironically offering social criticism, which tragedy and melodrama often attempt." And that is a quote from Wegner. Sirk viewed melodrama as a way to show the American family and intertwined with tragedy. Melodramas and film noir were two amazing genres that were created during the aftermath of post-World War II cinema and are still common genres used today. And here is an iconic scene from The Godfather, one of the greatest movies of all time.
"You said you come into my house on the day my daughter's to be married and you asked me for murder. Money.
I ask you for justice.
That is not justice. Your daughter is still alive."
Let him suffer then. She suffers. How much shall I pay you?
Buonasera. What have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully? If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
Be my friend? Godfather?
Good. Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day.
Grazie, Gasfala.
Great.
That scene truly shows what a film noir is. It shows the use of lighting and the crime underpinnings that go on to represent the whole movie. World War II had a massive impact on cinema as a whole, and therefore there are three distinct eras of cinema that can be viewed from it: pre-war cinema, World War II cinema, and post-war cinema. Each distinct era used different techniques and created different types of movies. The pre-war era can be viewed as a transition to sound and color and the use of more distinct stories. With the use of sound and color, new genres were developed, such as musical, which are still popular today. Some wonderful movies were created in this era, such as Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. The next era was the World War II era cinema. This time period showed that it really was all hands on deck for the war, including cinema. The US government offered to pay money to filmmakers who created movies that supported the American way. This was a huge era of propaganda that hit all sections of cinema, and Walt Disney even made cartoons that were for the US cause. A lot of these movies are racist and dehumanize the Japanese and other races. This era was clearly defined by the propaganda-based cinema. The next era of cinema was the post-war era. This era can be defined as the birth of new genres such as film noir and melodrama. There were some very dark movies created in this era. The post-war era filmmaking placed a larger emphasis on camera techniques and a developed storyline. Some of the greatest movies of all time are melodramas and film noirs. One of those is The Godfather. This classic film is often regarded as the greatest film of all time, and it shows what a great film noir is. Each distinct era of filmmaking were all essential in making film what it is today. It is essential to understand the huge impact that World War II had on cinema, and each distinct era developed wonderful techniques that can still be seen in movies today. Here is the works cited for all of the quotes I used during this presentation. Here are the image references for all of the images I used in this presentation. And here are the 2 links to the videos I used during this presentation. Thank you for your time, and thank you.